When we last left Yuka, she was standing in between the body of a conquered foe and two newcomers who may befriend or something worse than the beast she just felled. Let's find out. Yuka decided that she absolutely loved garlic. She chewed the sweet, buttery hunk of bread that had been given to her, swimming in a bowl of thick, brown stone goat stew. Her legs were propped up on a small stool, while her backside rested upon a cushioned seat in a wonderfully warmed tent, larger than any she'd ever stayed in. As she ate ravenously, her thoughts turned back to the day that was now behind her. Standing next to the body of the dead fell, next to the broken tree, the bearded man and the bright-haired girl had looked as though they were about to send Yuka to the green spirit on a cloud of spitfire smoke as they approached her. Yuka had been so utterly exhausted from the flight and the fight with the fell that she had not even raised the broken icicle in her hands to defend herself. Her legs had felt like driftwood, and her arms like winter-weathered stone. She was bleeding from half a dozen parts of her body, but felt no fear as she waited to die. Let us see how many spitfires it takes to kill Yuka, Godrider and Fell Killer, she thought to herself. It was the old man who lowered his spitfire first. He said something in gruff words quickly to the young girl with him, gesturing forward with the spitfire towards Yuka. Yuka was confused. Perhaps he wants the young one to practice her aim? The girl spoke. "Your name, please, woman." Her words were accented and oddly spoken. Yuka stood nonplussed, uncertain. I'm Yuka. The bright-haired girl nodded. She did not lower her spitfire, but her arms and shoulders looked to relax somewhat. She spoke again. What is your tribe of origin, please?" The girl's words came slowly, as if it took a great deal of time to form them. Yuka widened her stance and straightened her back. "I will not show fear to the likes of these. I am Yuka, daughter of the Greeneress Siku of the Halo tribe and the Copper Shards." When the bright-haired girl spoke again, it was in a different language. She spoke hurriedly to the man next to her. Yuka knew nothing of the words, but was shocked to recognize the cadence of them. She had heard this language spoken many times by the richer of the trade caravans that would come through the village during the warmer seasons. Her heart gave a small jump. These two were from Camden. The bearded man answered her in the same language. He spoke gruffly and made a frustrated gesture towards the girl, moving his hand downward over and over. The girl lowered her spitfire, along with her head, looking chastened. The man spoke at length to the girl, gesturing to Yuka several times. The bright-haired girl did not meet his eyes, but nodded occasionally. Should I run? Yuka thought to herself. She decided to stay rooted where she stood. She had no strength to do anything else, really. I have no food or provisions, and less strength to move anywhere fast. The girl's voice took her once more from her thoughts. We beg you, please, noble woman, to dine at our camp with much food and hot to drink." The girl then gave Yuka a slight bow. She stood there, next to the freshly dead fell and a broken dustwood tree, uncertain of what to do next. This girl has much to learn of our language, Yuka thought, but I do not think they mean me ill. Yuka eyed the tall, bearded man carefully. Under the deep red cloak he wore, she could see that he had a powerful frame. His hands were large and his fingers long and thin. Under his cloak, Yuka could see the handle of some long, strange-looking blade at his side. The girl had been last to lower her spitfire, but she seemed like the lesser threat of the two. "I will keep my eye on you both," Yuka promised with her eyes. "Where's your camp?" she asked the bright-haired girl. "Near the small river, not far." The girl spoke quickly, pointing down back towards the brook. The girl chanced a small, friendly smile at Yuka. Yuka looked in the direction she had pointed, knowing the uncertainty of her safety if she went with them. These folk could cook me alive for stew for all I know. Despite the danger, she could not deny her current situation. Her wounds were sending agony of every shade all over her body. She was in sharp pain, dull pain, burning pain, and she was very, very cold. She was thirsty and felt as though she had not eaten in years. These people hail from Camden. She heard the Light Rider's words in her head again. I fear what they want from us, and what they will do to get it. The great woman of the Deep Mother would despise the very thought of me traveling with the likes of these. Yuka then considered her Aunt Aglu. Her aunt would not wish starvation and death from her wounds, at the risk of contact with Camden. Yuka stepped forward. Show me, she said. The girl did not lie, their camp was not far. It had begun snowing as they had stood next to the dead fell. Yuka walked well out of arm's reach from the other two as they walked her down the small hill, along the trickling brook Yuka had dove into to escape the fell. She had no weapon on her, but was ready to fight or dive back into the water at a moment's notice. Every bit of her remained tense, until she smelled cooked meat on the air. For the second time that day, Yuka's stomach rumbled so loudly that it must have woken every spirit on the wind of the forest. The bearded man stopped in his tracks, tensing. He'd even gripped his Spitfire with both hands, and looked around fearfully at the source of the noise. The bright-haired girl seemed to have better hearing, and turned shyly to look at Yuka. Yuka had failed in appearing unaware of the noise. She had met the girl's eyes, and in a strange moment, she could not help but smile. Both had giggled, drawing a long glare from the bearded man. Food ahead soon. The bright-haired girl pointed to a trail of smoke a little farther down the riverbank. Yuka nodded. She moved forward to walk alongside the bright-haired girl. Your name? Yuka asked. She was uncertain of how many words this girl knew of the Yoked languages. The girl smiled. Ennui. Yuka nodded, then gestured down the way towards the bearded man. His name? Fallhurst. The name was the strangest Yuka had ever heard. She tried sounding it out a few times. Fallhurst. The man glanced back once, but then ignored the two. The girl helped Yuka sound out the word slowly, and after, Yuka tried the bright-haired girl's name again. Ennui. The name was simple, pretty even. It seemed to make the girl happy when Yuka pronounced it correctly on the first try. She spoke Yuka's name again. Yuka. Yuka nodded. The two continued on for a few steps in awkward but companionable silence. A cold wind coming from the south washed over them. Yuka felt a biting pain in her broken nose. Instinctively, she brought her hand to her face, groaning. Her fingers, already spotted with dark red from the duskwood splinters, came away from her nose with congealed blood. She felt a hand on her shoulder suddenly. Yuka tensed and looked over to see Ennui, looking concerned. Hurt? She asked. Yuka looked herself over and grinned at the girl through the pain. All over. Ennui nodded and pointed towards the trail of smoke down the river once more. Healer. Soon. Yuka nodded in reply. Wanting to distract herself from the pain, she gestured towards the bearded man leading them. Father? Ennui chuckled and shook her head. She seemed to ponder the right words. Master. The word was simple and short, but hit Yuka hard in the chest. Is this girl a slave? Yuka had only ever heard the word master followed by the word slave. She had conversed very little with the trade caravans of Camden that had come along through her village. Most of the traders were men. Every caravan had a leader, with others working for them. None who worked in the caravan were chained or looked to be toiling or suffering overmuch. She never thought of any of them as slaves. Her father, Kupin, had been the first to teach her of slave and master. He told her that there were people in the southern lands, far from the borders of Yoked, that enslaved men and women alike. They were cruel peoples, faithless, and without any green spirit or deep mother to guide them towards any other path. The first time he had spoken the word slave to her had been during one of her father's fireside stories of high adventure. He had been speaking of a dark, bloody kingdom with wicked leaders that built massive structures of stone, all on the backs of wretched, weak folk, agonized by eternal labor. Folk in these lands were to be bought with coin and trade. The story had given her nightmares for months. The girl, Anhui, seemed to notice her discomfort. "Wrong?" she said quietly. Yuka shook her head and walked on in silence. The small trail of smoke in the trees ahead was getting closer. As they neared, Yuka saw the older, bearded man, Falhurst, take out what looked like a fat clay pipe from one of his pockets. Yuka wondered whether or not the man preferred the same type of smokeweed as Aglu. As the man brought the pipe to his lips, he began to blow on the odd instrument, and a low, melancholic whistle hit the air. It sounded like the song of a bird, if it could hold a call longer than a few moments. A few heartbeats later, a similar sound, this one higher than the previous, answered the whistle from somewhere up ahead. At the whistled reply, Anhui sighed contentedly. "Safe. And supper." She pointed ahead. The trio trod over a small hill next to the brook. There were large rocks covered by a thin layer of snow, and the group had to walk carefully. Yuka looked down on the other side as they reached the top of the small rise. The sight below stunned her. Down the snowy path along the small river was what Yuka could only describe as a small, movable village. She had never seen so many wagons, nor once quite so large. Her village in the Copper Shards was difficult to travel to. For her home, there were only a few small goat trails that led safely through the rocky crags and snowy ravines. Most of the tradesmen, even the rich merchants of Camden, could only come through with a small group of 2 or 3 wagons, usually pulled by one of their odd southern horses or a team of trained jaka. There were at least a dozen wagons here. They had been looped and roped together in one great ring, encompassing all of the camp. 4 huge fires roared in deeply dug fire pits at 4 different points at the center of the wagon ring. Every one of the wagons had a team of at least 2 thick, hairy horses from the lands below the cliffs of Yoked. There were few people as young as Anhui and Yuka, from what she could tell, but there were a great many men and women alike. Some wore the deep red cloaks that were draped over the shoulders of Anhui and Falhurst and had the same coloring of skin and hair. But near half of the folk below Yuka looked to be from places far and away from either Yoked or Camden. As the 3 reached the edge of the camp, Yuka could see short, bearded men in huge, thick brown hoods, with skin even darker than her own, wearing gold rings that glimmered with gems of 100 hues. All around the camp were a number of women with skin and hair as white as Anhui. All wore the same long white cloak, lined with what Yuka could only assume was immaculately dyed mountain cat fur. Every one of them called out a greeting to Falhurst as they passed. Yuka could not stop looking around wildly. There was a large, fierce-looking group of people on the west side of the camp. They had arms like massive tree roots and shoulders like boulders. Most had their heads shaved, save for a single long, black ponytail coiled in the very center of their heads. Their hair looked to be oiled in some kind of fat or grease. As Yuka entered the camp and passed their wagons, she could see that every one of these huge, muscled men and women, most of whom would have been tall enough to look down onto Connie, had deep, patterned scars cut into their cheeks and foreheads. Anhui caught Yuka staring at them. She nudged Yuka and shook her head quickly. "Looking long. Don't. Not them." Yuka nodded, chancing a quick glance back at them. A great many eyes from that part of the camp glared back at her. She felt a shiver creep up her spine. The fierce, scarred men were far from the only eyes that followed the trio. It seemed to Yuka as though everyone in the camp stopped for a moment to stare. They did not stare at the tall, bearded Falhurst or the petite Anhui. Yuka could see their eyes all over her. I should have taken my chances in the wild. The trio reached the large tent at the center of the 4 top fires. The tent was made of a thick, reflective material that Yuka did not recognize. Its 4 points were piked firmly in the ground. Long mounds of dirt had been dug and raised along all 4 sides of the tent to block the wind. 2 massive hounds of a breed Yuka had never seen before guarded the front. Their coats were black and sleek. They almost shimmered in the dying daylight above them. One raised his head and gave a loud, warning growl at Yuka as they passed the fires and entered the space of the tent. Ennui raised a hand up, and Falhurst gave a loud snap of his fingers. The hound whimpered and lowered his head back to the ground. A woman emerged from the large tent flap at their approach. She wore a worn, lurker-skin coat with wooden toggles, and wore a fur-lined head wrap of jackal-leather. Yuka was bewildered to see that the woman was Yoked. She was near the age that Aglu had been, powerfully built, but much smaller than Yuka's massive warrior aunt. Her eyes held the same depth that Aglu's had. Aglu's eyes were ones that could be kind as quickly as they could be fierce. This woman had the same. She began speaking angrily to Falhurst and Ennui in the same guttural language that the two had spoken in front of Yuka earlier. As far as Yuka could tell, this woman spoke their tongue as well as if she had been born to it. It was a long moment before the woman's gaze turned to Yuka. She stopped mid-sentence and looked from the two Camden to Yuka. After blinking and shaking her head free of confusion, the woman said a few words to Falhurst. He replied with a few of his own, then a shrug. The woman turned to Yuka. "Child of the living north, where do you hail from? You've the copper rings of a singer of the green wind in your hair, but the black cancan of a swimmer of the black etched in your face." She seemed distracted for a moment, looking hard at Yuka's hair. Yuka had nearly forgotten the story of her legend, etched into the tattooed kangan all over the lower half of her face. "I am of the Halo tribe. My mother is Siku." "The Greeneress?" the woman asked. "Yes." Yuka halted herself before saying anything else. "She speaks to me like I'm a child, though she sees that I wear the kankan of a tested woman of the black." Yuka drew herself up to her full height. "Before I say more, I shall hear where you hail from." The woman had kankan of her own. The ink on the lower half of her face was the forest shade of crushed starleaf. She was of the green faith, but Yuka did not recognize the designs etched in the woman's cheeks and chin. At the stern tone Yuka took from her, the Yoked woman gave a small half-smile. You speak to a proud child of the Peak Mountains. My lot are sisters of the Song tribe." Yuka blanched. A tribeswoman of the Song. There is as much known as there was unknown of the Song tribe of the Peaks. Yuka had always been told that they were a mistrustful, loathsome folk. They were fierce followers of the Green Spirit. Many a night Yuka had sat by the fire and listened to whispered stories of the dark green mysteries of the Song. They had never suffered trade caravans to traipse their mountain trails, and many a wandering traveler was known to disappear if they climbed into their rocky slopes. The only means of trade that the tribe was known for was that they were the primary source of sime-root seeds for more than half the lands of the Yoked. The sime-root seeds that came from the lands of the Song were said to contain untold great mysteries of the Green Spirit. "Your name?" Yuka said, keeping her tone firm. The woman's eyes glinted with a roguish mischief. The look reminded Yuka of Aglu in so many ways. "You speak proudly for one who is bleeding from so many parts of her body." The woman looked Yuka up and down. Yuka was once again reminded of the harsh ache in her nose, her bruised ribs, and the burning sensation in her hands and arms. "I shall call the healer." The woman of the Song looked to Falhurst and spoke quickly in his language. The tall bearded man turned and looked Yuka over. He noted her many wounds once more. Nodding, he turned and barked several orders at the entrance of the tent. 3 young boys, wearing matching nut-brown jackets and trousers, exited the tent flap quickly. The man gestured to Yuka and seemed to point towards one of the wagons on the other side of the camp. One of the 3 boys rushed towards the far wagon while the others re-entered the large tent. Ennui suddenly turned to Yuka. She was grinning again, amiably. "Take care, now, yourself." Yuka held back a grin of her own and nodded gratefully. She glanced to the Yoked woman, who looked at Ennui affectionately. She was holding back a chuckle behind her hand. When she met Yuka's eye, the Yoked woman spoke. "My name is Lusa." Yuka considered the word, in their language, midnight. The healer was a man unlike Yuka had ever seen before. She had never met a man who was a healer. In both faiths, green and black, it was the steadfast hands of the elder women who were entrusted with the bodies of the villages. The man was shorter than Yuka by a head. He had skin so bright she could almost see the veins in his scalp. He was hairless, save for his massive beard, blacker than charcoal covering his chin. He was painfully slim and had arms as thick as a miner's. The strangest thing about him was that atop the mound of his bald head, he wore a set of eye coverings that looked to be made of thick black glass. They were held together with bronze rims and a thick leather strap. In the great tent Yuka now sat in, he did not wear them over his eyes. The healer's gaze was transfixed on Yuka's arms now. He had examined the back of her head and neck. He would speak with Lusa, and Lusa would translate, asking questions for him or telling Yuka to move her arm or leg in some fashion. Anhui and Falhurst were nowhere to be seen. They had left the tent with another of the brown-clad serving boys. The last of the three Yuka had seen before stood patiently in one of the corners of the tent. The tent itself was a sight to behold. Not even the richest bronzesmith in Yuka's village could have afforded luxury like this. The floor was covered by white and brown pelts from a dozen creatures. There was an enormous bed set up on the far side of the tent with 4 small cots lined up against the other side. Iron candle holders held thick wax candles throughout the tent, bringing a comfortable light. A table and chair made of beautifully carved duskwood was next to where Yuka sat. On the table was rolls of parchment she had seen other Camden tradesmen possess, along with a multitude of shimmering brass, bronze, and gold instruments. On an unoccupied wall of the tent, a large rack that looked to be made of lurker bone was built. The rack was holding a collection of 4 beautiful, oil-polished Spitfires, and 2 blades that looked like they were made more for a pretty sight, rather than fighting. One was long and straight, the other shorter. The shorter blade was wider, and curved like the moon in its last waning. "He wants to know if you've had anything to eat today," Yuka asked suddenly. Yuka's mind was cast back harshly into its current situation. She turned around to look at the small bald man and shook her head. He grunted, then began mumbling to himself. "Is he uttering a spell?" Yuka felt suddenly uneasy. Lusa scoffed. "He has no power of that sort, I assure you, girl." The man suddenly bent towards a large leather bag buckled at his feet. Opening it, he tinkered around with something that clinked musically. When he rose, he held 2 bottles. One was thin, and held something that was the color of the sky when it was bright and blue outside. The other was fat, and held something black. He spoke to Lusa. Lusa relayed the words. "The first of these, the blue, you are to drink. The second you are to rub into the wounds of your arms and neck. He can change the bandage of your wound on your head. All of this must be done after he sets your nose right." "What?" Yuka looked around at Lusa. The woman shrugged. "Your nose is broken. We will have to set it right. It is better to do it soon." Yuka looked back at the man. His expression was stern, but his eyes held no malice, from what she could see. "How is he—" Her voice trailed off as the man raised his hands to her face. She shrunk back from his touch, but felt a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Ease now, girl, of green and black. He will not harm you." Yuka felt herself relax at Lusa's words, in spite of initial unease. "He will wait a long moment before he does anything. He must fully gauge the structure of your nose before—" The man's hands suddenly shot forward. Yuka felt a pinch of both thumb and forefinger, but did not see what they did in the next few moments of crackling pain as they blinded her. She felt as though her face might split from the pain, but after a few moments the tight, tense pain that she had felt in her nose since breaking it against the branch and fell ceased. Her sight cleared as the pain receded to a dull throb. She looked into the smiling eyes of the small, bearded healer. "Forgive me, I lied. It is better for you when you do not know what's coming," Lusa said apologetically. "May the green and black curse you all," Yuka said as she brought her hands to her face. She looked up at Lusa. "Thank him for me." Lusa relayed the message to the healer, who smiled. "Now the ointments, bandages, then food." The blue liquid had been bitter, but the ointments on her arms and neck had not seared nearly as much as the resetting of her nose. Shortly after the healer had left the tent, food was brought. Anwi and the other two brown-clad boys had re-entered the tent with a banquet that almost brought a tear to Yuka's eye. One boy held a massive bowl that Yuka knew instantly was filled with stone goat stew. Another held a platter of thick, greasy boar bacon. It crackled with a sharp black spice that Yuka did not recognize. Anwi held the bread. From the bread came a scent that intoxicated Yuka. All looked to have been freshly made, the heat of the feast filling the top of the tent with a glorious cloud of steam. Yuka filled the stew bowl that had been handed to her with bacon and grabbed the largest loaf of bread she could find. Bread from the south had always fascinated her. It was made thicker, rounder, with much less oil than the yolk had made theirs. Yuka broke the ovular bread with her fresh bandage-wrapped hands and inhaled a sweetness that almost made her gasp. The noise she made was noticed. "Garlic. I love it too," Lusa said, dipping her own loaf in her stew. Though the feast was massive, only Falhurst, Yuka, and Lusa were given bowls to eat. When wondering about this, Yuka asked Lusa, looking concernedly at Anwi and the three boys, who sat quietly on their cots on the other end of the tent. Lusa shook her head. "You are not in Yokehead in this tent, girl. They'll eat in good time. Now is when the guests of the master are served." Lusa jerked her head towards Falhurst, who had taken his bowl to the small table near the large bed. He looked to be poring over some old parchments on the table while he ate. As the rich food settled in her stomach, Yuka began to think of those in the party that she had left on the cold road behind her. Here she sat in a lavish tent, surrounded by tradesmen, riches, and steaming food, while the light rider was more than likely struggling to keep Nanak and the rest of her women in line on the road. She thought of poor crippled Imik, trying to keep up with the hard women of the north and the east. She also thought of Takani, on the warpath of the wicked sky-criers. While she basked in warmth, he hunted cursed warriors to avenge a woman that he served. And a woman I loved, she thought to herself. She felt the guilt wash over her, worse than any pain she had felt from the battle with the Fell. "I cannot stay here," she said quietly. "Hmm?" Lusa grunted through a mouthful of stew-soaked bread. "I cannot be here. There's someone I am after on the road." Lusa's eyebrows raised. "An enemy?" "No," Yuka thought. Though she thought to herself, "Not a friend, not yet. I was supposed to bring him Aglu's totem. I was supposed to show him that I was capable of carrying her legacy in my own hands. The totem is now with my pack at the bottom of the brook somewhere." The thought despaired her. "I must continue the direction I was going, where Falhurst and she found me." Lusa weighed her words through another long bite of stew. "I would advise against that, girl." Yuka frowned. She set her suspicious eyes at the large bearded man, looking at parchments at his table. "Am I a prisoner?" Lusa shook her head. "No more than I." Lusa looked at the man at the table as well. As she gazed at Falhurst, she said, "Do you know who that man is?" Yuka shrugged. "A wealthy tradesman?" Lusa almost choked on a laugh through a bite of stew. "Yes, he is, of sorts. He is likely the wealthiest tradesman you are ever like to meet, girl. And he is the brother to the greatest warrior that Camden has to offer." The thought did not assuage Yuka's unease. She had never met a warrior of Camden. Lucy continued, "I am his translator, his bridge from his world to ours." "And how did a woman of the song come to aid a Camden tradesman?" The older woman sighed, taking a drink from the wineskin from next to them. "A tale from another time." She handed the wineskin to Yuka. "How long were you in these mountains by yourself?" 2 or 3 days. Yuka kept her tone level. "Why were you alone?" Yuka took a long pull from the wineskin as well. She looked into the songwoman's eyes. "A tale for another time." Lusa held her gaze for a moment and smiled. "A child of the north you are, girl, though I must say the tale of your cancan tells me it is one that you must tell me some day as well." Yuka could feel unease returning to her as she remembered who had etched the cancan into her face and the task she had set herself kneeling next to her dying aunt. I must leave in the morning. Please tell them. Yuka nodded towards Falhurst. Tell them I am thankful for the food and the treatment from their strange healer, but if I am not a prisoner, then I must away, and soon. Lusa looked softly at Yuka and opened her mouth to speak, but stopped before she uttered a word. A cry sailed into the dining party from outside the tent. A man was yelling from somewhere, and others were joining his cry. Lusa rose. But Falhurst had jumped up from his table and ran out. Lusa and Anhui followed him. Yuka hurried to join the growing group outside the tent flap. The world had turned all to night as Yuka had healed and dined in the grand tent. All around was black, save for near 100 torches, adding their light to the great pit fires around. Yuka could see over the heads of the gathering camp to see where everyone was looking. A man, dressed like one of the scarred men she had seen earlier in the day, was riding one of the great furry horses bareback. He was riding up and down the wagon line. His face and form was flickering in and out of the dancing torchlight. He was calling out to the camp in the Camden tongue. At his words, many other men raced for more horses. A few even began buckling on weapons. What is the man saying? Yuka asked Lusa. The woman stared hard at the edge of camp, her jaw set. He is a scout, she said, fear betrayed in her voice. He says there are men hanging from a tree just down the brookway. Many men. As the scout yelled out his message once more, Yuka corrected herself. Yoked men. Yuka felt the grand feast freeze to coals in her belly. Tikani, she thought. Her belly full and the trail dark ahead. We shall meet Yuka again on this strange adventure.